It's time to stop thinking that all non-native species are evil. Invasive species are scary. It was ecologist Charles Elton back in the 1950s who introduced the militaristic invasion metaphor to describe exotic plants and animals. But there's no question some can be extremely destructive. The brown tree snake has eaten a dozen kinds of lizards of forests in Guam to extinction. Zebra mussels clog pipes around the Great Lakes, etc. As scientists have sounded the alarm about these pets, the public has gotten the message. Citizens rip out non-native plants. So we've learned, scientists and laypeople alike, that native species are good and non-natives are bad. Julian Olden, a biologist at the University of Washington, who co-organized a symposium, recently polled nearly 2,000 ecologists. Among his findings, a substantial number of them said they would immediately eradicate a hypothetically non-native forest plant, even if it were shown to have no effect on the forest. Olden calls us the guilty even when proven innocent. That kind of approach is not very useful on a rapidly changing planet. Exotics are everywhere. Climate change is making it harder even to decide who the invaders are. So what's going on so far? We've got non-native species that come into an area, and I guess they disrupt the natural habitat. They eat species that normally would live there and cause all kinds of trouble. And that's what most people think, and even most ecologists in recent polls think. However, it looks like we're introducing a new idea now that, in a world that's changing and climate change is changing, maybe we're not sure who the invaders are. Paragraph 8. How, scientists at the symposium wondered, do you define native on a warming planet? When plants and animals are already moving toward the poles or up mountainsides in search of climate conditions they can tolerate. So they're saying animals have to move to new places anyway just to survive climate change, so they technically have to be non-native, it sounds like. Should we consider them invasive? We would not want to necessarily move them from the areas which they are. And then there are the non-natives that we actually like. Most domestic crops are exotic in most places they're grown, but contrasting that, there are even wild exotics that do good, forming useful relationships with the native species. Edwin Grolsch of the University of California told the recent symposium about one such relationship. On beaches in his state, non-native spartina grass has become important habitat for the endangered California clapper rail, a plump shorebird with a downward curving bill. A project to rip out and poison the spartina, which grows in dense swaths that exclude many other shorebirds, saw clapper rail numbers go tumbling downward. There are other examples like that. The endangered southwestern willow flycatcher nests in invasive tamarisk shrubs. Many native Hawaiian flowers are now pollinated by the Japanese white-eye bird because the native pollinators have been driven extinct by other non-native species. Should we impose further risk on already endangered natives by severing these relationships? Interesting question. Or should we admire the resilience of nature and let such well-behaved exotics stay? Leave them alone. More and more conservationists are arguing, and stop focusing obsessively on categorizing species as native or non-native. Mark Davis, an ecologist at Malacaster College, once considered himself an invasion biologist, but not anymore. I'm actually trying to get in the field to retire the invader narrative. So he doesn't believe it. It looks like in paragraphs 10, 11, 12, there are different species that are technically non-native, but they're helping some of the actual native species in various different ways. A good thing, not the only thing. After all, nativeness is just one environmental value and arguably not as important as preventing extinctions and preserving biodiversity. In some cases, we can best serve biodiversity by leaving the non-natives alone, or even brace yourself, introducing them on purpose. This is the thinking behind, for example, installing the Aldabra tortoise on the islands of Mauritius. The islands lost their own large tortoises, and the fruiting plants that formerly had their seeds moved around by these fruit-loving reptiles who have been on the decline. The tortoise that's related to the island's tortoise, a non-native from Seychelles in the Indian Ocean that was intentionally introduced, is now handling some of that work. So again, a non-native species doing essential work that the native species used to do in this case. Most of the time, for the time being, conserving species still means focusing on supporting them in their historical habitats planting natives and removing non-natives. We can and should do that in places where it is feasible and important to us. Okay, this last part. So the last part is really saying it's not the only thing we should be supporting biodiversity in general. And that's more than just classifying natives and non-natives. So this is written third person informative essay. It's about non-native species. There's an old idea that took hold that they're invasive and bad in the first 4 paragraphs, and that's even maybe the first 5 paragraphs. But that begins to be questioned in paragraphs 7 and 6, that in a rapidly changing environment, species have to leave their habitats. And what does it mean to be non-native and native? As they move, they are technically non-natives, but they have to do that to survive. And it goes on to say, well, in paragraphs 10 and beyond, that many of these non-native species actually help the habitat. They help other native species survive, so they're value add. And then we then have in paragraph 13 a conversion. Some guy who was an invasion biologist now is looking at it the complete opposite way. And the last paragraph, a good thing, not the only thing, that's basically saying nativeness is not sort of a virtue in and of itself. In a sense, it says we need to preserve biodiversity, and in some cases that means actually introducing native species, non-native species, or encouraging them. I think I understand the progression of ideas. I understand the topic and why it's interesting, and I understand the point of view. Let's answer the questions.